You have landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken.
And I'm your other host, Philip Marinello.
We're two guys thinking critically about faith, culture, and theology.
And we're glad to still have you with us. Thanks for listening. Had a pretty good launch, I hope. This is the last episode we're going to record before we launch. And already, again, like we said with the last episode we recorded, we're still very encouraged and humbled by the response, basically, that we've had so far with putting out a trailer and the trailer listens and the shares and the people we've reached out to be guests on the show. Just very encouraging, very exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing what God's going to do and just kind of what happens as we go in 2019 here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being part of the launch. And maybe after the launch, listening to some of our content about different things that we listened to in 2018 or movies we watched or things like that. You might have questions about what's the line between interacting with media and culture and those kind of things in a positive way and what perhaps the Bible would term as worldly.
Sure, no, that's what we're going to be covering today, right, Trev?
Absolutely. We want to think through these things critically, try to apply a biblical lens to figure out what are some good guidelines to approach this topic.
Yeah, the issue of worldliness is always an interesting one, and we don't hope to exhaust the subject or have anything like the final word on it. But as we are, like Trevor said, as we're going to be covering cultural products and media throughout the show, want to kind of give a bit of a background to kind of our why and just kind of address, like, here is why we on this show will be covering some stuff and kind of what our thoughts and guidelines are with things like that.
Yeah. I guess to maybe set up some of the endpoints as well, as far as the spectrum that you could take on this. On the far end, you would have the fact that we believe that there is some media where it would be immoral to consume it under certain conditions.
I absolutely agreed.
Yeah. And I guess on the other end of the spectrum is
it's permissible to interact with media.
With media in some way, and we don't need to like build a compound and go live in the jungles of
and I mean, I really, if your position is that it's completely immoral for Christians to like interact with media, you're probably not listening to a podcast. But if you are, hey, send us an email, tell us scripturally why you think that. Love to hear from you. Yeah. Trevor guarantees that he'll read your email.
Guaranteed.
And there's a good chance that I might.
He might read it, but I will read it.
Substance guarantee. I like that. I think we found our first thing is our substance listener guarantee.
There you go. So those are maybe our endpoints, and I think pretty much everybody rationally would agree with those things.
Well, I mean, there's some. I mean, I remember, I probably wouldn't have said that anything is permissible, but I do remember, like, probably in like late high school, early college, like, it would have to be a pretty extreme thing for me to say, without a shadow of a doubt, like, I'm completely categorizing that entirely as like immoral and like no Christian should interact with that at all in any way. And like, man, like saying that now, like that is still kind of a hard thing. Like when it's that final and complete, like I still go, is it like completely like absolutely wrong? So I don't know. Like I'm definitely I'll kind of show my hand a little bit. I'm probably a little bit more open, and I definitely have been in the past, but I'm probably a little bit more permissive, but like absolutely want to be holy and be wise and honor the Lord with the things that I take into my eyes and ears and mind and heart, and like the things that we take in affect us.
Yeah.
And they are like our life is, if our life is worship, and if we're seeing here at The Substance, we believe the word, we want to use a Bible lens. We'd love to interact with other people who are interested in these things, but here, like, that's where we're coming from. That's where we're starting from. So we want to be discerning and thoughtful and wise with what we take into ourselves, and also just the fact that like time is limited here in this world. So
man,
in a perfect
world,
that's
huge.
Yeah, because like at any point in time, even if something is fine, it's kind of hard to say that like taking in media is necessarily the very best thing that we can be doing with our time. So, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom to be exercised in these things.
And I would I think the time thing is just so big. It's such a huge part of the way I filter stuff, because my whole thought is like, I can live a fulfilled life without having spent these things in media. And I can be an intellectually fulfilled individual without having spent the time on certain media. And I can be all that God needs me to be in the Christian life without this media.
Yeah,
a
your
lot of
wife,
times.
your
Yeah.
job, your church, your community, like
Roles and goals.
your immediate ministry can be fully. You cannot take in those things
Right.
as edifying and enjoyable and like the wonderful, and like a lot of it probably to a degree is personality wise. Like for me, the common graces and the good things in there, for me, I just really, really enjoy. So I mean, personality is a part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's not like if somebody doesn't enjoy movies, we would ever make the case you have to watch movies.
No, certainly not. I mean, it's just like personal preference as far as how you use your quote unquote free time. Like you watch hours of soccer matches that I would just be like, why in the world? Just because
I
it
wish I
brings
watched
you
hours of soccer matches.
it brings you joy
Yes,
and enjoyment.
that's true. So there's obviously different categories there.
But the question that we want to look at is what is appropriate and what is in bounds as far as God's plan.
And I think even from a Christian perspective, there's such a wide range of views that you encounter nowadays on these things.
Enormous.
Why do you think some of that is? Like, it's setting it up biblically, at least, Philip. Like, where
Sure.
would you starting like to build the out of bounds zone? Like, what that would start to look like?
Your last sentence kind of made me think. So like why the wide spectrum? I think kind of before I answer that question, I
Sure.
think it's interesting to kind of look at that wide spectrum. And I thought you were saying like kind of putting the question forth to me, like, why do you think there is such a wide spectrum? You weren't, you juked it. But I think that an answer to that question is kind of interesting. I think probably two things, potential reasons why there's such a wide spectrum is one, people develop convictions on these matters, I imagine, and from talking with folks, because this is something as a movie lover, I've had this conversation with lots of people. It appears to me that a lot of people develop these convictions significantly to primarily based on their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
What they feel comfortable or uncomfortable with based on their worldview, their upbringing, their context, things that affirm the things they think or don't.
Yeah.
Or depending on how open they are to new ideas, like their convictions of whether something good or wrong is what do I like and what makes me feel comfortable.
So you said I juked you, and I think the way that you're saying that I juked you was the fact that, like, initially it seemed like I was going to be talking about the legitimate spectrum of views on something versus people who maybe have illegitimate permissiveness or non-permissiveness as it comes to media.
That's interesting that you said both sides of it. Illegitimate permissiveness or non-permissiveness. The illegitimate non-permissiveness is an interesting thing. Is that true? Because of like the conscience issue, which we'll probably get to later. Like we don't want to sin against our own consciences. But I think illegitimate non-permissiveness,
Man, that's hard.
is a really interesting thing.
I think you could make a biblical case for that category.
I think you absolutely could.
Yeah. But we've used the term
kind of
worldliness.
back up. Where
Let's
do
back
we want
up.
to start?
Yeah. We've used this term worldliness. Where
Sure,
in the
let's define our
text
terms.
does this even come from?
I don't know if the actual term I don't know if there's any words translated worldliness.
No.
But many times the world is contrasted with the spirit.
Sure.
So, or like the world is equivalent to the old man, is equivalent to the actions and thought patterns and habits and lifestyles that are outside of God's will.
Right. And so you're actually talking about a specific, in a sense, text study that you can do if you look at the use of the word world
in the New Testament.
Especially in the New Testament, and I would say especially in John's letters.
Okay.
John, the guy who wrote the Gospel of John and then wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and Revelation. And in 1st John, you get the classic worldliness text, which I'm sure you're very, very familiar with. I'm just going to read it from 1st John chapter 2, 15 through 17, New English translation. John writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father isn't in him, because all that is in the world, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes," and they translate, "the arrogance produced by material possessions, is not from the Father, but is from the world, and the world is passing away with all its desires, but the person who does the will of God remains forever.
Is that the net?
Yeah.
I like that you're using the net for the show. I'm still on the ESV, but I like that.
I do like the way that they are very conscious about trying to translate into English that people actually use and understand.
Sure.
And they don't have any ties to a traditional thing that you would typically need in a Bible translation as you're going from Bible to Bible, so it's not so jarring for the Bible user to pick up the new translation. But they're just linguists. So
Sure.
Anyway, that's for a different episode probably about Bible translations.
Which we may or may not get to.
Maybe like 2 years from now.
So exactly. So do not love the world or the things in the world. And it's very clearly contrasted because if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So loving the world
and the things in it.
And the things in it are directly contrasted with loving God.
Right. And so there's your term worldliness in a sense right there.
So we want to honor the Lord.
Yes.
We want to be true to what he has revealed as his will and desires for us. And we certainly don't want to be in direct stated opposition.
Right.
So do we love the world? Like that's clearly something, whatever this is talking about is something we don't want to describe us.
Yeah. And he even gets a little bit more specific, right, about the things in the world. Once again, from the net, the desire of the flesh and the desire of the eyes and the arrogance produced by material possessions. Some people would make the case that especially things like desire of the eyes.
Yeah, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes.
It's going to be accentuated or going to be that the media that you consume is going to feed kind of the evil part of you that is those desires.
And I mean, if we're all being honest, we can look at what's on TV and Netflix and Hulu or whatever, however you watch, like there are plenty of things that clearly fall in this category. Or even if you're very permissive, things that if not handled with like the utmost degree of carefulness could very, very, very easily stoke these exact things. I can see that, why somebody would say that. And then therefore, because there are things out there, let's just make it easy and avoid it all, or avoid everything with a certain type of rating, or avoid everything with a certain subset of content and just be like, let's make it easy and just completely avoid this.
Well, let's talk about that then. So I've been in this camp for, at least I used to be in this camp at a certain point. Hey, if a movie has...
Exactly. So you want to kind of give a brief sketch of like kind of your convictions through there?
I think it depends. It depends on the movie and the setting. Typically, generally, my conviction is going to be that Randy Alcorn said it pretty well in the Purity Principle, where it's like, hey, if you wouldn't watch this through a window, like you probably won't want to watch this through a movie.
Golly, that was really convicting. Which
is true, and at the same time is hard to apply in a totally analogous way to everything, because like I wouldn't watch World War II through a window.
Yeah, but you know what he meant. As far as like that, like he was talking about, like the sensual content.
Yeah, especially sensual content. And so I think that's a really good guiding thing. And I think John Piper has said this in some of his sermons where it's like, well, there's a difference between violence and media, especially we're talking a lot about movies because you've seen it, but I guess we could get on to music here in a minute.
Because movies are visual medium.
Yeah, and I think it's where everybody starts typically.
The language you hear and the images you see kind of all go together.
But yeah, going back to what John Piper said about violence is fake. Like you see somebody's head blown up, like that guy didn't get his head blown off, or like you see a guy get stabbed on TV, like he didn't get stabbed. Sure. Any of the violence you see in a movie, like it's all just theatrics. It's all props and all that kind of stuff. Unless computer generated whatever has gotten a lot more clever nowadays. Like if you see nudity on a screen, that's actually like someone's daughter or son.
Or just a person.
Naked, one of God's creation actually naked on that screen. And so there's a reality there to what you're viewing that to him puts it in a different category than violence.
And I mean, I would agree. That's probably the hardest area to kind of nail down like a perfect standard on for me. But yeah, like that's undeniable. Like that is a person to whom that you're not married to. And if you are, like, why are you letting your spouse take their clothes off in front of the whole world? So you would want to certainly avoid looking at that in an inappropriate way, but like it would be good to avoid seeing those images.
So I think a lot of people, when you just said that right there, just thought in their mind, what in the world do you mean don't view that in an inappropriate way? Are you saying there's an appropriate way to view that?
Yeah, I've had this conversation a lot. So perhaps, but there's also the option. Again, we can cut this out if this gets too in the way. Like,
No? I
still
think
feel
this
like-
is exactly what people come here
I
for.
feel like there's also an option of like not seeing a thing. If I'm squeamish and I know a guy's head's about to get blown off, like
Close
in a
your
movie,
eyes.
I can turn away also. So like I think there's also a difference between something that's drenched in sensuality versus something that like has a bit of it that I wouldn't put in it there. I don't think is morally acceptable that it's there, but
What
if
you're
it's very
saying,
easily to avoid, then I can still see a movie and not see that thing. Is like, I don't know, something that I think about.
so you're saying like you could do the equivalent of like going to the horror movie and reminding yourself in the middle by looking down that this isn't real. Like, I'm in no danger, to get yourself outside of the immersion so you don't have to feel that fear like you might do in a horror movie. You could get yourself out of the immersion so you don't have to feel that sensuality in or gore or whatever it is. Is that what you're saying that you could do? Like just kind of close your eyes and take yourself out of the situation, take yourself out of the immersion of the film,
I mean, I
and
don't know where,
and that makes it okay?
I don't know if immersion, I don't know where, like what that exactly has to do with seeing.
Well, I think the whole thing about a movie is you're in the scene. Like there's more. I think I bring up immersion because it's an audiovisual experience that you're
Sure.
in. So if you're talking about, I mean,
Sure, I guess then you
to
could
flatten it out, I could just say, so you close your eyes, so
sure.
you just don't see
you,
whatever.
You could unimmerse yourself for if it's a clearly like finite portion. Sure, you could not be immersed in that, and that could potentially be an option.
Yeah, most people are going to say, oh, well, just not seeing it's also an option.
It's true.
So some people would think, though, that that's the only non-sinful option.
That's true.
It's true that they think that.
Correct.
Okay, but they think that's true for you.
Well, and that's ugh. Okay. Then maybe they do think that. I don't know. I'm still working. It's a work in progress. I feel like I don't know. Like I've definitely matured throughout these things, and like I don't even know if this is like great radio here right now.
I mean, it's awesome radio. We're trying to get to the heart of the issue, right? And this is the heart of the issue for most people.
What is sexual content? in
Sexual
media?
content in movie media.
You think that is the main issue for a lot of people?
I think that for a lot of people, that's where they're going to go. It's that, or
That is understandable. I
we
guess.
could also talk, I mean, about what we're probably on the same side of, but on different side from other people. And that's like
language.
Harry Potter kind of stuff.
There's that.
Yeah. So we could go and talk about that too. Let me talk about that for a second.
I think that a lot, I don't know, in my personal experience, a lot of the people who I've known of who have not been a big fan of Harry Potter, I felt like have also been very, just in my personal anecdotal experience, have also been affirmative of other media, books, and films that have a magic or fantastical element that are more clearly scriptural influence, a la like Tolkien or Lewis.
Yeah. So they hate Harry Potter, but they like Narnia is what you're saying.
I've experienced a lot of those sorts of people where like I just go, okay, then you're kind of missing out on a cool story.
What you're saying is you're just pointing out
It's
that
inconsistent.
it's illegitimate because it's inconsistent.
Well, it's not illegitimate. I find it's illegitimate, I would say, to put that
On someone else.
exactly. Because again, like I think the overriding thing, other than you need to seek to honor God, is like each person's conscience. Ultimately, scripturally, you can be perfectly within the potential boundaries that are fine. But if your conscience is saying, hey, you shouldn't do that, and you do it anyway, like that's a violation. Like if you really feel in your heart that like reading or watching Harry Potter, you're like somehow affirming ungodly spiritual forces.
Yeah, exactly.
Like then don't. But
Isn't that divination is what I hear people say.
yeah, I just think that is maybe not the most informed or consistent
Sure.
position. But if you truly think that, like, I'm not saying that you should watch Harry Potter, just like we're not saying like if you think alcohol is bad, you should drink. Whatever your convictions are, like ultimately, like you're gonna have to answer to God for them.
I think it's really important. And if you are ever in conversations with people about stuff like that, stuff like Harry Potter, that kind of thing, like,
Or I remember, like, even Disney, like fairy tales, period, that aren't C.S. Lewis or Tolkien and have quote unquote redemptive story arcs, which a lot of the fairy tales do have redemptive story arcs.
Yeah.
But if they come from folklore or Walt Disney, they're more suspect.
And even if you do, I think it is good that you bring up fairy tales, because if you look at stuff like fairy tales and what is a fairy, you start looking at folklore, and a lot of that does come from like pagan beliefs about like weird forces in the world. You know what I mean?
Sure.
About just when you look at some of the stories, or you listen to Aaron Mankey's podcast Lore, especially some of the early episodes, and he explores some of these concepts.
Is that good?
I enjoy some of his stuff.
I've heard a lot of good things.
It takes a little bit getting used to his voice, I think, but once you do, like, he tells some of these stories about
trying to get to like the roots and like the
tales.
Real like origin of these things.
A lot of it that's interesting to me is when he's got like legitimate historical notes where people were like saying like this kind of stuff was real about this fairy thing or this other stuff that happened,
just
or
in the
like
forest eating kids and stuff like that.
Stuff like that, where like actual police notes and that kind of stuff on certain things where like they took action and arrested this person because they believed that XYZ.
So all of that to say,
like, you could press this ad absurdum.
Yeah.
But
I'm not trying to argue anyone out of their conscience.
And I think that's really important, because is what looks like an absurd conviction to me, if it's genuinely felt by you, it is not correct for me to argue you out of it. And I think it's okay to like biblically work through something. I did this with a guy that I was working with in college ministry before, where he grew up in a family that he had either like grandparents or somebody in the family who was like really into like the occult and divination stuff.
Oh, okay.
And there was a time in America where like the spiritualism movement was super, super popular and had been affected by that. And so when his parents got saved and became part of the church, part of what they did was they left that behind.
Oh, 100 again.
So
100%.
for them, it was way more than just, we think there's some Old Testament text that says I shouldn't watch Harry Potter. It was like, this was literally our life beforehand, and so we had to leave this.
I would never, ever, ever, ever try to be like, but you know, the Prisoner of Azkaban's real good.
Right.
I would never do that.
Right. But I think,
although it is.
And I think the stance that I did take with him, though, is just to point out that, like, hey, your conviction on that does not equate to it being sinful for everyone else who would view that.
Sure.
So I think that's where texts like Romans 14:5 talk about each must be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who, it talks about observing days, because he's talking about, context specific issues there, but the one who does gives thanks to the Lord, and the one who abstains for the Lord and gives thanks to God. So none of us lives for himself or dies for himself. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. We're the Lord's either way. And
kind of as a, it's not along the exact same lines, but I think kind of another verse to kind of put along with that is, it's again John 13:35. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So in our disagreements, to always remember, like, if you really think that somebody's doing damage to their soul or their conscience by participating in media or imbibing a substance, go to them in love. Like, if you're just arguing on social media or just slapping the Harry Potter book out of every hand you see, like, that's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
If you truly think someone is damaging themselves, talk to them. But, like, remember that we're all going to stand before the Lord on our own. And on something like that, I really, really think that there's a lot of grace for those sorts of things.
Let me also ask this question then. So we've kind of talked about conscience, which is obviously a subjective thing.
Yes.
So did we just set up a completely subjective morality when it comes to these kind of things?
Ask that question again.
So if it's just up to, hey, this guy's conscience, he doesn't like Harry Potter, so he shouldn't do it, but he can't tell this other person not to do it. So what I'm saying is it literally is okay. This person just doesn't feel like it's okay for them, so they shouldn't do it. But I can't just say like, well, I feel like, it doesn't harm my conscience at all to, go on whatever adult website just to push it to the extreme. It doesn't hurt my conscience at all to do XYZ, so I'm just going to do that.
Sure.
And then the person comes and points it out to you, and you're like, well, that's your conscience, but don't stomp on mine.
Sure.
How
No,
far do you
it's
go?
not
Where's
completely
that
subjective.
line?
I mean, I don't know exactly where the line is.
Yeah,
but
maybe not be.
where scripture is clearly, I don't know, because some of these things are hard. There's not a one size fits all answer, or else it would be like very clear and we wouldn't be having this discussion.
That's true. And I think the reason why it's not clear is it does lie kind of in your heart, in your own conscience, in your own self, because the whys of how you're interacting with something and why are you pursuing it?
Exactly.
And how is it affecting you?
I think that's enormous, that for definitely a certain portion of my life that I didn't really even think about. Why do I want to consume XYZ thing? And like, does whatever perceived value that I find in XYZ thing, is it maybe outweighed by some of the content I'm going to have to endure or hopefully avoid? The motivation and goal, I think, is really something that the more people should consider before they pursue, decide to press play. Like, is this something I should be taking in?
I think
just active viewing and listening
right.
in general, I feel like is something that will hopefully clear up some of these questions.
I think what you just said right there is super important, like this active viewing, because we have such a binge watching.
Active viewing or active non-viewing, whatever it is.
Right. But active, like literally taking the reins and keeping control of your media intake and being purposeful with it is what you're talking about. Because we're not talking about just, I think it's so crazy that in our culture, binge watching is becoming a term that people use. And like, if you look at the term binge, it literally means to consume in a kind of gluttonous or sinful way, in a way that is objectively morally abhorrent. Like, that is the term binge exists to describe that thing. And so to use it in conjunction with watching is to say that you're doing too much of it, but it's become a socially accepted norm that this is just something that people do. And so connecting that with what you were saying about being active and purposeful with our media intake is the fact that if you aren't being purposeful, if you are just letting the next thing, whatever, play on Netflix and just whatever people told you at work was a fun show, and you're not thinking about the content, you're not thinking about what the objectives are of you watching that and thinking through those things. Not you can't just enjoy something, but
at least at some point of the process when deciding whether or not, this movie or show is out and I've heard things about it that make me think it might be interesting to watch.
Right.
Should I watch this?
We can just get lulled into this passivity where we think that something we watch is just something that we watch and whatever. But everything you intake, media or otherwise, it all has an impact on you.
100%.
It all influences and shapes the way you view reality.
Yep.
And the realities that you will tolerate, or the realities that you will be comfortable with or acclimate to. Like,
sure.
It does that. And so I think no matter what, I think we can lay down a principle that we should be thoughtful and critical about the kind of things that we let into our mind, because you have to be the gatekeeper. Nobody else is going to do that for you.
Yep.
And you don't have to let
any
kind of entertainment in your mind that
sure.
you don't feel comfortable with, or that you feel is going to lead you to sin. And in some sense, if you
if you don't have that question at all, that's immaturity. If you don't ever run it through the process of, will this be a stumbling block for my soul, for my heart, or for the people around me that in Christian love that I have obligations to?
Right.
Like, will this be a problem for me? Not just will old people or intolerant people say, like, tell me on Facebook that, like, I'm a bad person for watching these things. Like,
sure,
throw that out. But, like, literally, like, will this have a deteriorating effect on your soul, or will it harm your witness? Or these things, like, these are questions that at some point should be thought about.
And can I flip it around too? Because one thing I just noticed about all the questions you asked right there was that most of the stuff that you mentioned were negative. Will
sure.
this have a negative effect on me? I think a better question really is to ask,
Sure.
what positive effect will this have on me?
Mhm.
You said about the time earlier, you weigh out the different ways that you can spend your
hours,
time,
yeah.
the hours that you could spend. And I honestly believe this, that there are cases in which watching a movie could have a better positive impact on you and your ability to engage the culture with the gospel than reading the next theological book.
Okay.
That's possible depending on what kind of you've
What
already
the
consumed
circumstances are
around
and
doctrine or
why
whatever
and-
else, and what you need to round out your thinking on the world and those kind of things in your life at that moment. But I think that's an important thing to think through, because what do you need? There's certain things that we'll review on here that we wouldn't recommend to everybody at every stage in life.
Sure.
There's certain people where if you're coming out of a certain life or you're just struggling with a certain thing and you're trying to get victory over it and you're thinking through that and you're thinking through doctrinal issues, there might be other things, media, books, songs, sermons, whatever that you need to listen to or read or consume and get your mind trained in a certain way before you get your mind trained on whatever else. Because I think everything that we're going to be talking about will have some sort of mind shaping quality to it.
Sure. Well, everything
That's the whole point
everything
of the
necessarily does.
Yeah, everything does. But I think the point of the substance is we're not just going to be like reviewing, I'll just throw out like Game of Thrones.
Certainly not.
Well, and honestly, that's one that we could bring up because
That's an interesting question. Go for it.
for me, I have a really hard time understanding how, and this might sound harsh to y'all out there, so apologies in advance, but I have a hard time understanding anybody who claims the name of Christ could watch it.
I do too. I wasn't necessarily there at the beginning. Full disclosure, it came out when I was in college.
Mhm.
I watched most or all of like the first episode at like my most permissive, like in probably the most permissive stage of my life. But even for me, I was like, no, this isn't what I want to be putting into my mind.
Right. So why? Like what's different qualitatively about what's going on there? And I mean, if you don't know, like obviously it's sexual content that Game of Thrones
Very explicit,
that is
pervasive, and very clearly for the purpose of stoking unlawful desires. So I mean, you don't want to parse everything, but like you want to make whatever artistic merit that the show may have, which I hear a lot of great things about other aspects of it. But the fact of the matter is the explicit, pervasive, for the purpose of like stoking inappropriate desires.
Yeah.
It's just so much that like, I guess you could watch it on the Mormon View or whatever.
Okay.
Like you could do that.
There's
and
like
if you
media censor
whatever,
things you can
what's
plug
a
in
vid
nowadays.
angel.
What
If
they
you
call
did
it.
that,
Yeah.
like, okay, I don't know. It doesn't seem terribly wise.
I would even question in a certain sense that, because it's like if you need a cool fantasy story, can't you find one elsewhere? Or if you needed documentaries about like
like is
the War of the Roses
is
or
the
something,
desire
like,
because you're like it's just so great, or is it more to like kind of fit in, or what? I don't know. And like I knew people that before.
That's a huge one you just mentioned there about peer pressure.
Sure.
Just because everybody else is watching it and talking about it.
And I mean, I did know people who named Christ, like who, when the first season came out, before it was clear that, I mean, it was kind of clear from the beginning how sensual it was going to be, but who are like, you know what, like this is pretty compelling and pretty good. Like we're a lot of people watching it together, and like there's accountability, and like we're trying to avoid it as much as possible, and fast forwarding and whatnot. But like I think at a certain point that kind of fell apart, and they're like, no, like this is pretty rugged. Like we're gonna pull the plug on it. So I mean, like to say that were they wrong for doing that at the beginning? It probably wasn't advisable.
It is kind of funny though. It's like, all right, we're gonna lock ranks, and we're not going to band together for holiness to reach the world or to do this thing, but like we're gonna charge headlong into temptation, like
sure,
literally like almost what John Owen would call entering into temptation. But don't worry, we're gonna be clicked up so we can watch each other's backs.
Hey, that's a very valid point.
There is a level of silliness when you view it at a high level. At the same time, what's different between that and then say Schindler's List that had nudity in it?
Sure.
And I think what, if you've seen that movie and the kind of categories you might put that
But there
in.
was also content that didn't involve torture as well in that film.
Sure. So in other
Sidebar.
words, it wasn't all just portrayed as like,
No,
prisoners in their state of whatever
no, there was also
deprivation.
sensual content
Sure.
besides. But I know what you're saying. So like something that's
In other words, like, I don't know, a category of non-sensual nudity in a way.
sure.
But
Like
even
12
that,
Years a Slave or something like
sure,
that.
sure. I haven't seen that one.
Okay. Schindler's List. Gas Chamber. There you go.
But I think what that gets at is some of what we're talking about, where you have this movie that is describing a culturally relevant topic that at least that portion of it, right, the non-sensual portion of it, is there to describe the awful, inhumane realities that we're faced with, which is the product ultimately of the evil that lives inside of us, right?
Sure.
That we like to think was just some other people.
It's a worthy exploration in and of itself.
Right. So the difference is that we're talking about, one is loving the world, like loving the world, loving the things in the world.
The very explicitly like the lust of the eyes and the lust of the heart.
Right. Versus trying to understand a truth or a principle or explore or know yourself better or think through a philosophy as depicted through film that is using maybe some of these means to depict those things.
Sure.
Is that?
No, I think those things are qualitatively different. But
we're not trying to create an argument for anybody that says that you should watch this so much as to say, and I think this goes back to
there's a qualitative
there
can be a qualitative difference.
This is what Paul says about, in this case, abstaining from vegetables, or abstaining from meat, actually. Sorry. He says, but you who eat vegetables only, why do you judge your brother or sister? And those who eat everything, why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. Therefore, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, we must not pass judgment on one another, but rather determine never to place an obstacle or a trap before a brother or sister. So what he's saying there is that in issues of liberty, where, in other words, where Scripture doesn't have a thou shalt not for it, even where some people thought that they had a thou shalt not from the Lord for it, right? Like they felt like they shouldn't eat that kind of meat that was sacrificed to idols, which was what was going on there. They felt in their own conscience that they had a law that applied to them that
Sure.
they had to submit to.
They
Paul
thought
saying, no, it is all lawful. I know that true from the Lord. But if you don't know that or you don't feel that, then you're obligated to live by that conscience. But at the same time, you're also obligated not to pass judgment on the people who are doing it and think of them as sinful lowlifes.
Mm-hmm.
But then the people who are permissive also need to not look at the people who are abstaining and look down on it like, bunch of know-nothings, bunch of legalist weirdos.
Sure.
On that side. So that on each side, mutual care, encouragement,
because again, the goal,
love,
like we are called as believers, and again, that's really the only people, believers or nominal believers, who are probably considering these things. Where it's like, if your goal is to honor God, then loving one another is the second commandment.
I think it's an important thing. There's not really a way to secularize it other than just self-discipline. What is mental trash versus what is mental upbuilding? And that's really a lot of what you're talking about with this topic is
it's like what's spiritually like damaging.
Right.
What will damage you spiritually if you take it in versus what will edify you spiritually if you take it in.
I think that's a huge point. And I think something I was listening recently to with Brett McCracken, or past guest, depending on when this airs, was talking about there's certain things that with seeing this thing, like, did I progress in my knowledge of the Lord or in my knowledge of the world or in my knowledge of,
and maybe not knowledge of the Lord, but like kind of
as a person,
edification in a way.
What did I leave better off than I entered?
Yeah.
That's what you're aiming for, right? Is to have something that is going to add and not detract from your growth personally and spiritually. And I think those things are intertwined.
Sure. No, it's hard and it's not easy. Like,
a
I
whole
mean,
person.
just that question there brought up the movie Braveheart to mind. Where, and I know some pastors were even calling this out a couple years ago, where they're like, Braveheart's always bringing up, but like, there's like sexual immorality in that movie, and it's like, there's a time where that was like one of my favorite movies. I still think highly of it because every time I've seen that movie, at the end, I do feel emboldened and inspired to like be a good man and to live a meaningful life. Now, I don't need that movie for that.
No.
But like, that is the effect that film has
It's
on
a
me.
positive effect.
So like the fact that I need to skip something brief that may or may not be intended to titillate, I don't know. I mean, that argument, like, that's kind of a, like, you could say anything is, maybe not, but like, that's very easy to contain, if you want to call it break the immersion or whatever, to literally skip past something very, very simply that's easy, that isn't pervasive or terribly like pertinent to the story itself, to have those positive effects.
Sure.
Like, I'm not going to say somebody that watches Braveheart is necessarily meddling with the same type of thing as that somebody watching Game of Thrones is.
Yeah. Because Game of Thrones is episodic and there's just a constant bombardment and there's a lot of material there.
The sheer volume.
Yeah. That's movies.
Yeah, and this isn't hate on Game of Thrones, however, either. It's just...
No.
We want to strive for holiness and something like that.
Right.
I feel like...
I think it's just a pertinent example.
Is very clear. Well, and in our culture, it's so pervasive in our culture.
Yeah.
It's like the number one show around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also important sometimes when we're looking through these things to be culturally self-aware. And I think that's some of what can help us process through, like, how much of this is, are we being subjective about morality, or how much of this is just objectively, like, there are gray areas there. But it's important to think through, like, the culture's approach to how individual we are. Families used to live together. You would see probably a lot more things in first century Israel.
I see what you're saying.
Then,
Sure.
like,
Walk this out a little bit more. I see what you're saying.
So, like, yeah, when you lived in close community, or even folks that like live in New York, and they say, like, listen, you look out the window, there's so many people just packed into a tight space, you will see life happening. And so that's different than like suburbia, where you've got your house and you've got, you know, all of this individual space. That's just, so what I'm saying is, to back this up real far, is just, you have to recognize your cultural moment and like where the culture that you live in and some of what is considered normal for you and those around you may still be culturally defined and would have been different, you know, in a different city or maybe 1,000 years ago, or different things. And that could affect the way you think about, like, well, is this objectively bad stuff, or am I, you know, is it just bad for me because of the culture I'm in and I'm used to, and my
give me an example. I think
sensitivities?
I'm following you. Give us an example.
Well, I think, you know, specifically kind of talking about like nudity and that kind of thing, it's real obvious, and this didn't go well for David, obviously, for a lot of reasons in his heart, but he could see people bathing on their roofs. And I think, you know, obviously that went really bad for Bathsheba, and him and Uriah and all that kind of situation that happened there. But the point being that he lived in a big city. I'm guessing that she wasn't the only one, unless this was, if we do a cultural deep dive on that and say, like, well, maybe she was being promiscuous in some way by doing that, but that's not what I've seen. I think it's just culturally it was different, right? Like, these kind of things were different, and we might see, therefore, aspects of whether it's nudity, but just providing the bigger principle, whether it's that or language or violence or all those things, the culture that you are a part of is going to color. And we've already talked about that in different ways. What is central
what
for you?
What sets off like a red alarm in your conscience?
What is sinful for you? Like, literally, what is sinful for you? It will change those things because culture does define a lot of that.
Well, no, sure. And I mean,
different things will connect with your heart differently.
It is interesting.
Because
I've
of
been around the world a little bit, and in various contexts, it is interesting hearing how, yeah, the language one is an interesting one, where in context, words kind of mean different things to different groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
So, And then you have the people that take that to the full spectrum, basically going like, well, then like there's no boundary for speech that is ungodly. Like I can literally say whatever I want because in some cultures it's fine.
Yeah, and we'll deal with that in a future episode when we tackle language and cursing
episode.
and
that'll be weird.
that will be. I'm looking forward to that.
That'll be interesting.
Pull up.
We should
some science.
I was
going to
say we should get a good guest on that one,
or just
just us.
But we can talk a little bit about that and music.
Sure.
Some people might look down on you for picking up I wouldn't say newest, but maybe picking up a historical cultural piece like an NWA album.
Sure. I mean, I'm a big hip hop head, and I talked about that on the show. So, I mean, I think one of the things for me that I've grown in is the motivation, the why. I think as a big hip hop fan, like at least in one go around, I probably listened to more things than I would listen to like for entertainment or enjoyment. So like if a new thing comes out that I know is popular or a lot of people are listening to, not to get anybody's approval, but to kind of like be aware. Like sometimes I'll listen through it once or twice. And I think that is different than just kind of bumping it over and over. And it's on heavy rotation and I am imbibing it.
Right.
Like it's like picking up a bad theology book. Like I can pick up a book by a guy I disagree with that has terrible theology that's espousing ungodly things in God's name. I can read that, evaluate it, form opinions on that, put that back on the shelf. And that's different than picking it up, reading it, going, I now believe these things.
Right.
And now,
or I'm entertained by these things, and I think he's got a new, fresh perspective, so I'll keep it around, even though maybe I don't believe it myself, but this is fun.
Sure, exactly. But I mean, again, like I've limited and eliminated a lot of stuff, and not that I never listen to any secular rap for enjoyment. I do it much less frequently now, and even sometimes when I do, like my conscience is pricked where it's like, hey, this is probably the limit that I should be listening to this, whether if it's for its workout. I know there's plenty of good hip hop that I also do listen to when I work out, but sometimes I'll put something on that I used to really like and it'll be fun for like a couple of sets or whatever. And then I go, you know what? Like I really don't want to like be resonating with these messages. But there's other guys who, let's say, use profanity, and maybe have a perspective that I wouldn't fully agree with, but who are not promoting misogyny and promiscuity and violence and drug culture. Like they're not promoting those things. They're in the culture condemning those things. And I appreciate that. And I applaud that, especially if they're doing so skillfully and lyrically. I do love hip hop. And if there's a guy who's speaking out against that, like eloquently and has some content in it, like that's not necessarily going to disqualify it for me as a listen. But there is that line, and like for me, it's like a subjective conscience issue. Like sometimes I'm like, okay, this is interesting. I can say a lot of things are good, but like at a certain point, like I need to turn this off and give me some classic Reach or some Humble Beast.
All right, this is going to be maybe switching topic a little bit here. So we've talked about being purposeful and active in the media that you're consuming, thinking about how that is going to better you as an individual.
Sure.
Right? It's going to contribute to discipline. It's going to contribute to your worldview. It's going to contribute to your spiritual life. And so you're really talking about pursuing quality, right?
Sure.
And looking for things of
hopefully,
quality, things of substance.
Yeah, that's the goal.
So what about Christian media? God's.net 3.
Jeez.
And so I don't know. I'm just making up a movie. Is that even a movie?
No, it is a movie.
Oh, it is a
trilogy
movie.
now.
Oh, golly. I didn't know that. I was just throwing that out there.
I was at Walmart.
All right,
the
God's
other
Not
day.
Dead 17.
Well, they're not there yet.
We're on their way. And
That's
obviously,
hilarious.
Maybe as people are listening and they hear us laughing now, maybe know where I'm going with this.
No.
What do you think
That's
about...
almost an episode in of itself.
Okay.
But I mean,
what if our reaction to worldliness is that strong of like, you know what? Like, I can just not be worldly because I'm going to create this Christian subculture where I never have to worry about worldliness.
Yikes. There's a lot in there.
I can have my movies and the Bible truths too.
Let me try to. I wasn't ready for that, but let me boil it down and like try to get to a couple of like what I think are the most essential aspects of that thing.
Okay.
So like, I think one is like, why do those even exist? Are those actually being made as evangelistic tools to attract the world to see them, to hear our message? Or is it like a poor way of emulating the world? The ones that are done really poorly, which a lot of them are to some degree. And again, like, and I don't want to like just crap on them either. If these are brothers,
somebody worked hard on it.
Who nobody sets out to make a bad movie.
Nope.
Not even the guy that made Manos.
Oh my!
Nobody's trying to make trash.
So he didn't really set out to make a good one. Let's be honest.
He set out to make a movie.
He did set out to make a movie.
Technically succeeded. But like, why?
Right.
Is it like trying to emulate the world and to be cool, or I don't know. But like the people that make them and the people that watch them, I feel like there's two different things. Or the people that champion them and who have churches buy out theaters to see these films. And I don't think that like the world doesn't know that there's a market there of people that they can easily cater to either. So like it's really, that's a whole thing. That's hard to kind of answer like in 2 minutes here at the end.
That's a good point.
I'll say this. I really think very clearly that the answer to avoiding worldly content is, I think it's very clearly not to then create like an echo chamber of similar material that
like
is
a parallel universe,
quote unquote, like the clean version of all these things with good, neat and tidy messages that like reinforce the things you already believe.
Yeah.
Like some of those people are trying. Yeah. They're all trying, and like some of them are not awful.
And I don't think we're trying to necessarily like poo-poo on somebody's good intentions.
And you know what?
If you enjoy it,
I know people that have seen them and have been encouraged by them. So like, I can't argue with that result. Just like if somebody laughs at a joke that I think is stupid, like that was a funny joke to that person. So like, art is subjective.
I think what you said, even in that answer, and we've said so many times over the course of this podcast, is a really good way to kind of sum up. And that is the question, why? A, you should be asking it. And B, you shouldn't get offended when other people start asking it.
100%. You should always be open to being challenged on those things by other believers if you're a believer.
And I think if you are getting frustrated by that, it could be a good sign that maybe your heart's not in the right place.
Yeah, maybe the reasons you have, if you even have reasons, are maybe not good ones. And you're finding out, oh no, this thing that I like might not be the best thing for me, and I don't have a good reason.
As I'm starting to think about, man, I'm a third away at least through my journey on this world.
Yeah, dude.
Like, whatever. If it's not that great, fine. Like, I can let it go.
Well, and that was kind of funny because when we talked about the 2018 year-end media review, I usually intake a lot more media than I did this year. But, man, I'm working on a business venture where, like, I'm half of a company right now. I'm married. I had my wife was pregnant with our first child through most of the year, and the last couple months we've been trying to figure out like
how to be
getting used to like raising our first child. So necessarily a lot of stuff fell to the wayside. I do have a list of things that I think that I would like very much and have a lot of value that I'm hoping to catch up on.
Sure.
But we necessarily like make decisions with our time, and like, are the things that we take in worth our time? I think that's a really important question.
Yeah. You know, at the end, just some words from what Peter wrote in his first epistle. I love what Peter says, where he says he's thinking about his own death and he wanted to leave behind his letters so that we would have a testimony of the kind of stuff that he was teaching the churches. And so really we can be taught by the apostles still today, which is a really cool thing to think about. He talks about we are a holy nation. He's using Old Testament terms here for the church, for Christians, a people of God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You once were not a people, but now you're God's people. You were shown no mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to keep away from fleshly desires that do battle against your soul. And he goes on to talk about maintaining good conduct, which will be a witness to people.
And is this even on our radar? And I mean, this is something that my wife is very good at, like continuing to put back on my radar
tend to be
because of the and one of the things that you alluded to that podcast where Brett McCracken was talking about some of these things before, the importance of community. Like for me as a married man, it's been very edifying realizing that my most immediate community is my home.
Yeah.
And my wife's like I don't just have Philip Marinella's convictions anymore. I also have Anna Marinella's convictions to like deal with in my decision making.
Yeah.
So that's something that I need to like joyfully embrace as I make my own decisions when it comes to discerning what I should and shouldn't experience and enjoy in the culture.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I mean, because we are going to talk about media on here, and I'm just imagining this scenario coming up, and so I just want to have my conscience clear on this. But like, if you are listening to this right now and you are under authority, and there is something that we have reviewed that
if you're a kid,
if you're a kid and
or on a college campus with rules, I was so
rules,
bad at that.
sure, college on campus with
really
rules.
Bad at that.
If you are, whatever it is, where there's some authority that's saying like to you, hey, like the one that you are by God under obligation to listen to them. Have a dialogue, but don't take anything that we review as an endorsement of doing that. And if you do that,
no media is essential.
And you source us as the reason why you can do XYZ, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now, you're wrong. Stop it. Don't drag us into that. Stop it. We're not on that. We're not on that anyone's side of any fight necessarily there. We just want everyone to think through these issues clearly, and also want to encourage people that as we look through stuff that
that's a really good point.
We're wanting to look through that as well and think about that.
Thank you for bringing that up. I never would have thought of that. That's a very good balance.
Yeah. So, yeah, if we are your reason why you think XYZ is okay to do something, then you haven't listened to anything we've been saying. You gotta go press to the why, and like Philip just said, reference your community, reference the people around you who know you. Don't expect that you can on your own also just evaluate what's cool for your conscience and soul.
And if you're really, there is something wonderful and kind of magical about sitting in the theater by myself and literally being immersed in something wonderful on the screen. But after it's over, I don't have anybody to really interact with. I do love kind of ruminating on things, but like the amount of stuff you intake by yourself, it could be really enhanced by taking it in with others.
I think you just said something that's so interesting. And
hit me.
And I would love, if you're listening to this right now, like I want to put a poll up later on Facebook for this as well. So jump on our Facebook stuff, because I would love to hear your response to this. And here's the question, because I think for me the answer is no. Have you ever bought a ticket to a movie and gone sat in a theater by yourself? Not with a friend, not with anybody you knew, but just by yourself to go watch a movie by your lonesome.
Gonna separate we'll the cinephiles from the common man.
We'll put out the poll there later, but I think I'm pretty sure I'm on the no category for that. I don't think I have ever bought a ticket and gone to a movie by myself.
I don't know what the stats are at all, but
Josh
if we also look at
that he went,
that's impressive. But legit though, like if we just look at the stats, the numbers of movie tickets you've bought, period, versus movie tickets I bought, period, it's likely that I'm going to be going more by myself. But like
that's true.
We also are very different, and like
that's true.
I'm certainly in the cinephile category of like, it's just a thing I love.
Yeah,
I wouldn't go to a sports game on my own, probably.
Well, I've never done that either.
Okay,
I don't get out much, probably. Not like
back in the day.
Concert. This is probably Stephen Curtis Chapman.
Yikes. Nothing wrong, I guess.
Whatever, I read a lot.
Oh, yeah, same. So you want to put up a poll? Have you ever seen a movie by yourself? What are you hoping to get out of that?
I don't know. I just want to see what the numbers are.
No, I'm sure it's going to be...
I'm genuinely interested.
I'm sure it's going to be...
You have like a prediction?
I don't imagine more than 15%
have seen a movie
by themselves. I guess I'm guessing it's somewhere between like 8 and 15%.
Okay. Well, you might... I don't know.
I don't think most people do that.
That'll be interesting.
Most, like the average, I read a stat, I don't know how accurate it was, but I read a stat saying like the quote unquote average U.S. moviegoer, and it's probably been up a little bit with all the franchises bringing people to the theaters, but like a couple of years ago, I don't think it was too long ago, maybe it was, and I'm just have a bad memory, that said like the average moviegoer sees like 6 movies in the theater a year. And those are like the big bad blockbusters that you're probably going to see with your whole group of friends or your whole family.
Right.
Those are like the Marvel movies or the big Disney movies or the holiday movies. You're probably not seeing those by yourself. So I'm sure that the average moviegoer doesn't do that.
All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great listener feedback on this, just given that it is such a conscience topic. People feel strongly in different ways. Just remember kindness and everything as
grace,
you do engage in grace with each other.
The goal is to edify each other, to like help one another like become more of what they're supposed to be like in the image of God, not to condemn one another.
Yeah. So, but do go ahead and jump on the Facebook page, facebook.com/thesubstancepod if you haven't already liked it or followed.
That seems to be where we're building the biggest community right now.
Yeah.
So I imagine a lot of these discussions and polls and things are probably going to be popping off on the Facebook group the most now. But you can also
tweet at us.
For sure.
How are they going to do that?
Follow us on Twitter at @thesubstancepod. And we have an email address that I believe is thesubstancepod@gmail.com.
That's right. You can send all of your emails that way, angry or otherwise, and I will read them.
And I might. And if you're real old school,
man, you can hit up even on a landline that phone number and leave us a nice voice message. We would love that. You can do so at 913-703-3888.
So
certainly not the last word on this topic.
No, it's the beginning. But I think like I'm glad that we're kind of able to kind of talk about some of these things, but then kind of broadly go back to the heart of this is always something that's going to be refining too.
Yeah. Thanks for coming by, listening to these things, and
subscribe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that way you will get all the great content that is coming up in 2019 right into your ears. All right. Thanks. Hey, can you do some, like, whatever your Anchorman stuff is?
Oh.
Check. Oh, yeah. You are. Check. Your mic is
this thing on?
Super popping today.
The unique New York. Unique New York. The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. What was the other one?
I don't remember.
Something walked in. I haven't watched it in a hot minute.